Bret and Heather. You are the co-hosts of the Dark Horse podcast. You're the authors, the co-authors of A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. And you're former professors, and still, I think always professors, of evolutionary biology. Welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thank you, John. It's
Thanks.
a pleasure to be here.
Great to be here.
So I loved your book. It synthesized a whole range of things that are part of what we try to do with this show and part of what I've been grappling with personally as a father and as somebody that's worried about the future of, increasingly the future of civilizations, which is something I want us to dig into right away. But I want to almost lay out a little bit of a table of contents because there's a lot for us to talk about. Bret, you have been out there talking about the collapse of Western civilization, and I want to really unpack that and understand it because I respect both of you so much. When I hear you saying things that bombastic, it's it's disconcerting. And but I also want to get into the stuff in the book that I think underpins that, about our nature, about childhood, about relationships and marriage and sex and how to be an adult. The book is so wide-ranging, and that's why we've got so much time together. So I guess to start things off, is Western civilization on the verge of collapse? And if so, what does that mean? Help me understand that, Bret. Bret, why don't you start?
Well, I would say Western civilization is an experiment, and it's one that has been wildly successful, but it's fragile, and it's always fragile because there is a more fundamental way of organizing people, one that is less capable, more dangerous, is worse in every important regard. But because it is more fundamental, when a superior alternative collapses, it collapses into this baseline state. And what I'm really arguing is that there are two bases on which a society can exist. Two reasons for collaboration of the level that would amount to a civilization. One of them has to do with genes. The simple fact that people share genes provides a rationale for them to cooperate, because in evolutionary terms, the cost of their altruism is reduced by the degree of their relatedness. So gene-based cooperation is what history looks like. What Western civilization really did is come up with a reason outside of genes for people to collaborate, essentially for people to put aside their racial differences, their phenotypic similarities, and to join forces on the basis that different members of the team brought different strengths to the table. That is a superior way of being. If you are limited to collaborating only with people who are closely related to you, then the toolkit available to you is small. If you can collaborate with anybody on the basis that they have something useful to add, then the pool is large. So that larger pool is utterly dynamic, and it explains why Western civilization has been such a powerful force for innovation, and it explains why people, once they see how it works, want to join. And that has been the recent history of humanity, is people who see our experiment, they want to become part of it. But as times get rough, the more robust form of collaboration is based on genetic relatedness. And so the collaboration between parties that aren't closely related tends to break down, and the collaboration within these lineages tends to be emphasized. And so I'm concerned that what's happening is the growth has run out, the ability to generate phony growth by borrowing from the future is now running out. And as the music stops and there aren't enough chairs, people are resorting to looking for who is live. Blood is thicker than water is effectively the rule that's taking over.
Heather, how do you see this? It's the same or different? Where do you guys converse about this existential threat?
I guess I would just add that we can see this at every scale, right? We see this at the individual level and within small institutions where we are being advised that appreciating and borrowing from other people's cultures is appropriation and isn't to be done. And that people who look a certain way need to atone for the sins of their ancestors. And then at the global scale, we see this in the form of ever more conflicts that really amount to ethnicity versus ethnicity, right? That they're actually lineage versus lineage. And we will never attain a stable democratic state across the entire world. It's inherently, as Bret says, neither stable long-term nor particularly robust. But we were moving towards something that was that appeared almost asymptotic, and now it feels that there is not just a movement away, but that there is an embrace of the movement away among too many of the players at every scale.
The thing that has been challenging, I think, certainly for me, but I think probably for a lot of people is I've always thought of myself as sort of a rational optimist, to borrow Matt Ridley's book, The Rational Optimist. And he and others like Steven Pinker and many basically point to this incredible hockey stick of prosperity, right? That you have the Industrial Revolution, sort of building on the tool set of the Enlightenment and the scientific method. And boom, Malthus was wrong. We can go from 1 billion people in 1800 to 8 billion people today, 4 billion of which seem to be living roughly a middle-class life that would look better than the life of kings and queens in 1800. So what are we complaining about? Isn't this all like still kind of awesomeness with a little bit of hiccups on a hockey stick of prosperity? I mean, that's not what it sounds like you're saying. So help me if I'm trapped in rational optimism to sort of break the spell.
I think the problem is you're looking at a pattern from which you cannot properly back out the hazards. And it's not that there is anything about the story of rational optimism that couldn't be true, but it will not simply be true by virtue of us discovering each new way to become more efficient. We are playing with very dangerous technologies. We crossed over in the 20th century to technologies that were literally capable of driving humanity extinct in one go. That was new, and so we don't have the evolutionary toolkit that would prepare us to be properly cautious about those things. And so far we've gotten away with it, but the idea that the market, this blind force, is going to navigate us wisely enough through that minefield is preposterous. What we need is enlightened governance. And I know that many in both of our audiences will bristle at that because it sounds like a desire for world government, which it absolutely is not. It is a desire for something that, oddly enough, comes out of Catholicism called subsidiarity. And what subsidiarity means is that everything must be governed at the lowest useful level. But there are some processes that are truly global. We need to have some way of managing the oceans so that we don't have opportunists depleting them so that they're not there for the rest of us. That somehow has to be managed at a global scale. On the other hand, the content of your local school doesn't need to be. And it turns out that medical policy is much better done where your doctor can advise you about your health rather than having the World Health Organization tell your doctor what treatments you have to take.
Yeah, so Dad Saves America is a show that is the product of an organization I founded called Emergent Order Foundation. So, I got that from Hayek, but I know that's obviously fundamentally an evolutionary concept. So when you think about enlightened governance and evolution, or just like the way people tend to actually have things emerge, do you have reason for optimism that enlightened governance is possible? Because I think that's one of the other things that feels like it's happened is the internet has kind of revealed to so many of us that the emperors have no clothes. And I think it's left all of us, myself included, feeling like, well, where do you turn for reliable expertise? And how do you not just sort of say, I don't trust any experts, which I don't think is a viable thing either. It's like, I'm not going to go to my plumber and tell him to do brain surgery on me. I want an actual brain surgeon to do it. But where does like expertise just become mouthing off and nonsense? And how do we get governance that actually works? You know, what do you have a thought about that? Heather, what about you? How do you think about that?
I think there are a number of questions in there. At one scale, expertise seems to be broken. Credentials are broken because the institutions are broken. Degrees don't mean what they should, maybe what they used to, but they certainly don't mean what they pretend to mean now. So in lieu of expertise, relevant experience, perhaps. Now, that may be just kicking the can down the road. How do we define relevant experience? If we can, it feels to me like agreeing that the credential is not a good proxy for relevant experience. Let's establish that as an assumption, which still a lot of people have not agreed to. Still degrees from, Harvard and Stanford and Yale seem to mean something to people, even as we see the utter garbage that's coming out of these institutions at the faculty and administrative level. And if the faculty and administrations are broken and confused, why do we expect the students to be less broken or confused as they graduate from those institutions? So what does relevant experience mean? Why is it that an excellent plumber doesn't require a degree in plumbing for you to trust him to come into your house, but an excellent doctor does? And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be some different kind of system to establish whether or not a doctor should be, should be someone that you trust. But I'm not sure that those standards as they exist are what they should be, right? We know that plumbing is learned from real experience with the physical world, what happens under different systems. And the fact is that used to be doctoring was the same thing. To what degree does that need to have changed because our technological advances have put what doctoring is outside of the scope of what any human being can actually observe? And to what degree is doctoring now something that doesn't have a lot to do with diagnosis because it serves interests that are neither yours nor your doctor's? And if it's the latter, then we've got a problem. And if it's the former, well, let's remember that actually our bodies still exist at precisely human scale, ipso facto. And therefore, there should still be a lot of room for actual diagnosis between patient and doctor at the very real human scale that we exist at. And that has almost disappeared in favor of the high-tech, you can't understand, I'm the expert, trust me on this level, which obviously is sending a lot of people to, early sickness and early graves.
You're touching on something that I think is something I've heard in themes of some of your more recent appearances, Bret, which is sort of talking about our elites and frankly sort of using the they, like the royal they, like what they want all of us to do or be or go away. How do you think about that? Because I think there's one sense in which I bristle at that. Like the notion of sort of elite conspiracies always feels like something that can't survive how hard it is for anyone to ever do anything. Like just getting things done is really, really hard. So like grand global conspiracies seem like they can't really happen. But how are you thinking about that? Because I know you've talked about sort of essentially elites conspiring, let's say. And I want to understand that. I want to hear you sort of defend that position, if you will.
Sure. But I want to go back to something first.
Please.
The question of why expertise has failed requires us to consider the possibility that it didn't fail organically. If you think about the market and the way it works, the fact that to a high degree, making money in the market provides you power, political and otherwise. What makes money in the market? Superior information. How do you get superior information? Well, you do it in part by not supporting a system that makes information public. In other words, we're seeing the failure of all of our public truth-seeking apparatuses. We're seeing it in journalism, we're seeing it in universities, increasingly we're seeing it in the courts. And you don't need to imagine that people got together in a conference room and decided to destroy truth seeking. What you need to imagine is that there are a lot of people in some sector who have an interest in being ahead of their competitors and therefore just have an instinctive revulsion at the idea that truth is going to be sought in a university, it's going to be published in journals that everybody can read, and we're all going to then make hay out of it. That sounds rough. If, on the other hand, you can privatize the truth-seeking and the public is left to flail with inferior tools, well, then you're ahead. And so people who tend to think that way do tend to be ahead, and they have more control over whether our system finds sanity than would be ideal for us. So this is actually an example of the model that I think you need to have in your mind in order to understand how to deal with the question of the very real fact of collusion and the obvious fact that those who think in terms of is conspiracy taking place can easily have that explanation run away with them because it's so hard to falsify. So I would argue, in my mind, I call the force that opposes meaningful change, the force that prevents us from moving in the direction that we should obviously go, Goliath, right? I use that because it reminds me of what sort of power we're up against and who we are collectively. But Goliath is a being composed of two parts. There is conscious collusion. We all know it. Anytime a corporation gets together and decides on a strategy that it doesn't share publicly, it's involved in a kind of collusion, albeit legal in many cases. But there is secret agreement to move in a direction that is in the interests of some party at our expense. And then there are also emergent properties. That is to say, a bunch of firms that are not in conversation with each other may have a united interest in freezing the public out of its ability to know what's going on. And they may find common cause, they may support the same pseudo-journalistic institutions that manage to misinform us so we don't see what's coming. So in my mind, we have some ratio. What percentage of what we are up against is actually conscious collusion, and what percent of it is emergent? And I don't know the answer. So I know that I don't know the answer, and I know that it's a slider. It could be that most of what we are seeing is emergent. It could be that most of it is the result of collusion, and I don't think it's wholly either one, but it can range from 0 to 1, and that's the way to think about it, the way to maintain it in the mind so that you can always adjust the slider with the evidence.
If I can add, we were just talking earlier this week actually about sort of where people seem to be ahead, or where corporations seem to be ahead. There are, and perhaps these aren't enough categories, but there are at least two broad categories of ways that they could have gotten ahead. It could be some kind of insider information, collusion, conversations with people that aren't public, et cetera, or it could be insight. And we tend to imagine that those who are ahead, those who are doing well in the market, those who are bringing something that appears to be new, are doing so through insight, because that's the classic way. That's the honorable way. That's what we all think about when we imagine market innovation. But innovation sometimes isn't innovation at all. So if we split that into these two categories, and within that one category is both the categories that Bret is talking about, but we have insight and we have insider information. We have rent seeking, yeah, something that propels you forward based on who you know, as opposed to what innovative, new, analytical, creative things you have thought. And it's harder to do insight than it is to do rent seeking.
I would also point out that it's not, if we take a recent example where we now know enough to say what took place, at least at some level, it's not wholly one or the other. The case of the mRNA platform that was sold to us as vaccines, there is a very real innovation there. Not a safe one, not one that you could rationally deploy into humans given what we knew as of 2021. But a combination strategy that took this highly innovative technology and fused it with lies, frankly, that kept the public in the dark about their own well-being, medically speaking, that combination turned out to be very profitable. So it's not right to say there's no innovation there. There is. And it's not right to say that this was, it wasn't entirely smoke and mirrors, but the smoke and mirrors made the innovation that wasn't ready for prime time viable in a way that it wouldn't have been on its own.
One of the things I'm hearing is that we have the baby and the bathwater, and it's not always clear what's the baby and what's the bathwater at any given time. Like, what is legitimate progress, innovation, and what is some corrupt rent-seeking shenanigans that's basically taking from one to give to the other to keep for myself. Is that fair? Is that like one way to think about it? When we look at like what's happening in our world, it's like what's worth. That's the hard part, right? What's worth saving of our institutions and of our leadership, and like what is like, no, you need to go. You're not a contributor anymore.
The problem is that the answer to that question is simultaneously absolutely apocalyptic and better than you think. This job isn't as hard as it looks, right? Good governance is never going to be perfect, but it's doable. We know how to do it. And the key ingredient is really the independence of the evaluators of policy from the profit. If you mix those two things, it becomes hopeless, because the people who profit by, if they make their slice of the pie bigger at the expense by shrinking the entire pie for the rest of us, then they get ahead and they get more control over policy. So if you don't have a firewall between governance and profit made in the market, then this is the inevitable outcome, right? You will eventually get loopholers enlarging the loopholes until that's all you've got. On the other hand, if you configure your way to just simply firewalling these things so that the people who end up with more power in governance are the people who have actually blocked the activities that were really bad for us and fostered the activities that were good for us, right? Not 100%, but just so that we, beat the odds. If you make that the key to success in governance, then the system fixes itself. Never perfect, but it's going to work. And really that's the question, is which side of the divide are we on? Are the rent seekers going to come out ahead of the rest of us? In which case, I can tell you how this ends. Or are the people who seek rent rather than innovating going to actually suffer because they've wasted their time on rent seeking, which is expensive, right? If that's the world we live in, then the world will fix itself. We don't have to micromanage it. And the problem is we've let this go for so long that it now seems preposterous that we would have good governance. Many people don't even believe it's possible, and that's a pretty hopeless situation, but it's really, this is the result of letting it go. We should have dealt with this when it was obvious 25 years ago, rather than waiting until it's an absolute crisis of governance.
So it's funny because I think we probably agree on a lot of things, but we might be at the fulcrum of where I find what you're saying challenging. So I want to like dig into that in a couple places. One is you've set up a dichotomy that I want to challenge, and which is that there's really just one thing. You're referring to the public and to us and to we, like there's a unified singular public, us and we, right? Like there's this like rent-seeking cohort or set, and then there's the public. Help me understand that, because I'm not sure that's true. Is that just linguistics? Is that just a shorthand? Like, help me understand what you mean by that.
Yeah, it's a shorthand. There's a we in this room, right? This is not a natural we. It doesn't go on, indefinitely. But is it a fiction to refer to it? No, there are purposes for which the we, if there's a fire in this building, the we in this room is a real thing that has to figure out what to do next, right? 3 weeks from now, this we isn't here. And so the question, well, who is we now, right? Is we, are you going to redefine it for every context? And the answer is, yeah, I'm going to. And it's the same thing for they. Sometimes there's a they that engages in collusion against us, but the they that engages in collusion against us then suffers from some of the dysfunction that it creates. So, are they victims or are they perpetrators? They're both.
So
Well, and who
I
is
have
us in any given context? That's kind of my question, because I feel like a lot of these forces and battles we're confronting are differences in values that are expressed by multiple we's. There's a group, there's large groups of people that believe the world would be better with one set of values, and they're different and disagree with this other large group of people and multiple.
I have an example of what I think you're talking about. And correct me if you think I've got any of these details wrong. NIH, National Institutes for Health, which is one of the main funders of all science, and I think the primary funder of medical research in the United States, has, of course, many sub-directorates, and that's the language of the NSF, with which I'm more familiar, but sub-institutions within it. And of course, during COVID, we all became aware of NIAID, which is, I believe, National Institutes for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, which since the mid-'80s has been run by Fauci. And that was public knowledge, but not widely known before COVID. And one of the major things that Fauci turns out to have done early in his tenure as head of the NIAID was to welcome in, this is a public granting agency, which means that taxpayer dollars are going to fund research that the people who are hired by the NIAID and who are brought in as peer reviewers of grant proposals understand to be in the public interest for that research to be done. One of the main things that Fauci did was to effectively begin to privatize NIAID by formalizing relationships with corporations, specifically pharmaceutical companies. And what that changed was, whose interest is this research in now? When the money is coming from Pfizer, how can we be sure that not just, it seems obvious that you don't want Pfizer involved in dictating what the answers are to a question as to whether or not the drug that they've spent $1 billion on R&D is safe. That's obvious. But how about if they get to decide much more cryptically to everyone who's not in academia or medicine? What if they get a person on the panel that decides, okay, of these 100 grant applications, which 8 shall we fund? Or 18 or 28 or whatever the percentage is, but it's less than half, right? So it's not going to be obvious. These are going to be subtle pressures that once you have someone representing a force that is inherently not interested in the public good, it is inherently interested in private profits, making decisions that are masquerading as in the public good, that I think is one example of what Bret means when he says we. We want research to be done that brings to bear to reach first all Americans and then hopefully all of humanity drugs that are actually safe and effective. An understanding of cancer that doesn't only look at half the equation but looks at all of the equation and understands what the trade-offs are. And when you have entities that are being allowed to fund these institutions, which still claim to be public, which actually have an interest in only one kind of answer or one set of answers, depending on what it is that they've spent their R&D on, then you're no longer actually serving the public.
The foundation of the West is the idea that we have collective interests which are served by putting aside all of the subordinate we's that you might have. This goes back to our initial discussion of lineages, which is a fractal. You can define we at many different levels simultaneously. But the idea that we, the people, are an entity who can be named, that we can describe what our rights might be, is profound, and I think also, at least in retrospect, obvious. The fact is, we have interests that countervailing forces may seek to erode, and there's nothing preposterous about describing the challenge to our rights, for example, to speak freely, as hostile to the interests of the people. They are.
Yeah, I think the thing, you mentioned subsidiarity, and I feel like the solution that is the sort of constitutional solution, right? The sort of US constitutional solution is to say, okay, there are certain things for which, let's just call it democracy, gets to have a say in. But we're going to make that limited so that everything else, the individual has to duke it out in a battle of ideas and in the marketplace, where there is no final say, and where what is right or wrong is going to change over time, and it's going to be competitive. There's not going to be like this single bullseye called the Congress that we're going to determine scientific truth by vote or by lobbying or by any of that. No. Congress shall pass no law to infringe the rights of all the things listed in the Bill of Rights, starting with the freedom of expression, association, religion, because no, unpopular speech needs to be allowed. Democracy is what's popular right now. So we have to protect speech and thought and association and religion from democracy. We need to protect all sorts of individual rights from democracy. Now, I'm very much a classical liberal, so I'm geared towards that individual, the we as a description of shared individual sovereignty, if you will. And what I'm hearing you rail against, which I totally agree with, is when you have these sort of centralizing authorities, the NIH, the federal government, the Federal Reserve, you name it, they're such an easy target for corruption because you can basically get a huge ROI. Oh, we have before we started recording, you were saying that France is now on their way towards banning any criticism of mRNA as a technology. Well, gee, if I can just spend a couple million or maybe even $1 billion to convince the government of my country that no one can criticize my product, there's a pretty decent margin on that investment. And it seems to me like the Western civilization solution was, well, no, the government shouldn't be allowed to do that. Like Congress shall pass no law. And is that at the heart of the way you think about this, a return towards, frankly, a policy of individual dignity that is individualistic? From a legal perspective, like treat everyone like equal, having equal rights at the individual level? Or is there some other way you think about that isn't maybe quite so libertarian, shall we say?
No, I think I have concerns that our founding documents are not up to the challenge of the 21st century, that there's just lots of stuff that the founders could not possibly have anticipated, and they did way better than anyone could have hoped, but that things have moved on, so the documents are not perfect for the moment. That said, the values that underlie those documents are about as good as we're going to do. And I've said in several different places that any system can be evaluated, the quality of it can be evaluated based on a single metric, which is how meaningfully liberated does it make people over the long term. So that is the objective. And it doesn't really matter how you get there. And I don't mean trivially liberated. I mean meaningfully liberated to do things that are important, to innovate, to think independently, to see so far ahead of what the Overton window allows that you may sound crazy now, and it may take 300 years to find out that you weren't. So that meaningful liberation is the key. It's what it matters more for humans than for any other creature by far, because the human mind is capable of making use of that liberation in a way that no other creature can. And what is tragic is to have a creature as capable as humans so heavily constrained by arbitrary structures, by conflicts of interest that we have with power structures whose name we don't even know. It is a great human tragedy, and it is putting us in tremendous danger.
And I would say one of the ways that our founding documents couldn't predict where we are now is with regard to how much technology we already have behind us that we rely on for new kinds of innovation, such that the market, the private sphere, creates remarkable innovations. But for the most part, it doesn't spend its money or its time on things that don't obviously have something at the end, which might be able to be brought to market, right? And so, the liberal arts and science tradition, which was for most of the 20th century, beginning around the late 19th century, became the model. Actually, after the sort of the robber barons of the turn of the 19th to 20th century, the new model for the 20th century American university, in contrast with like the German model for the university in the 19th century, was actually, we don't know. This is not a sage on the stage model. We are not coming to you and filling your brains with what we know and sending you off. We know that we don't know, and this is a time of exploration and, again, insight and creativity and analysis. And it's not clear that the marketplace can do that job, because why would it at some level? Oh, you're saying you don't know what you're looking for, but you're open? Okay. But what's the ROI on that, right? So if there needs to be, if then from that position we say, well, there needs to be public funding, if there needs to be a public space for both liberal arts institutions and also then one of the great products of liberal arts institutions, which is science, as distinct from engineering. Like, engineering does okay in the marketplace, science not so much, because science doesn't inherently have a practical purpose at the end. How do we, and this is, I don't know the answer to this, our founding documents did not predict, and I don't know how we get out of the mess that is, we went from science being effectively done by the landed gentry. So the money was just coming from their own lineage, and that was fine. There wasn't much conflict there, but of course it kept a lot of people out of science. To, oh, we're going to have public funding agencies that are going to do this. Oops, captured, right? And, captured increasingly over the course of the 20th century, but just, accelerating as exactly as we talk about in the book, accelerating at a pace that we can't keep up with at this point. Can the NIH be re-grabbed by the public? Well, that's going to require a lot of funding by taxpayers. And how are you going to justify a lot of the work that's being done, given that a lot of the work that's being done at this point is itself not particularly legitimate, because we're in a tangled mess with too many problems at this point.
You say quite correctly. I think it's an excellent point. And you say engineering does better on this than liberal arts and pure science. But even in engineering, we see this, right? We have many critical problems that could, in principle, be addressed by fusion power. But the problem is, because fusion power is a very difficult problem to solve, it is too far away for profit to drive the right level of investment. So, for example, if you think about whatever your concerns are or aren't about climate, if we had access to indefinite quantities of energy, then we could actually build a regulator that would allow us to control any runaway process that surprised us. So it is in our interest, so that we don't have to turn the world upside down and become tyrannical in order to fend off what may or may not be threatening on this front. It would be wise for us to invest in that technology to accelerate the pace at which we get it. But we're not doing it because that energy technology is a competitor for giants in the energy industry at present. That's one reason. And I would also point out that even if we allowed the current model to find fusion at the pace that it will find it, that if the fusion that it produces is then in private hands, it's not clear that it makes our problem better rather than worse. In other words, it may simply create a titan with its own perverse incentives, and this is a problem in which you really want wise people who have no conflict of interest to sit down and say, what is the proper level of investment and what is the right way to get there, so that in the end, this potentially marvelous technology is liberating rather than constraining.
Yeah, that's a very challenging the way you frame that's pretty challenging to me, because I think at one level, I'm not sure it's true that some of these things that we've left to the so-called public spaces have proven to be as good at what they're doing as we think, right? I think I believe the Howard Hughes Center for Medical Research actually outperforms the NIH in terms of basic research discoveries. I could be wrong about that, but last time I saw that, I remember reading about that not too long ago. It just, this distinction here, I want to better understand. This notion that there's this sort of public good that's not driven by incentives, if you will, and private benefit that is sort of profit driven, and that's the problem. It sounds like there's two different problems going on that I want to disentangle a little bit before we move into some of the like the pieces, the framework of your book, which I feel like all feeds back into this in the end. How do you think about what good government should be? Like, even just like, I guess I've watched you guys evolve in your thinking, even politically. A good example would be, I remember, you referred to yourselves as being of the left and coming out of academia and calling into question whether government run healthcare in the aftermath of COVID makes sense as a liberal principle. And I was so struck by that because to me, that's obvious. Like, how could you not come away from the COVID policy regime disasters and say, maybe we shouldn't have the monopoly of the government with its military might and its problems of politics to control all of healthcare? I haven't seen that many people reevaluate such a foundational sort of liberal principle. And I say liberal here in the kind of the American left-wing liberal sense. Like Jimmy Dore doesn't. He's still like, oh, we need Medicare for all. Dig into that for me, because that was like a big, like, wow, I was impressed.
Well, I would like to dichotomize between two states. One is from where we are now. I will speak for myself. I have a feeling I speak in sympathy with Heather as well, but I don't want my government empowered at the moment. I've seen how tyrannical it is, and I find myself in sympathy with ideas that I once found abhorrent, right? But that's because we're dealing with a captured entity, right? I don't want it empowered because I don't think it's on my side. In a future environment, is it conceivable that we could build and immunize a structure that would adhere to the principles laid out in our founding documents, and, among them, the 10th Amendment, the idea that that which is not specifically discussed is open and that it is left to the states or the people, something that adheres to the principle that is clearly alluded to by Jefferson: the government that governs best governs least, right? I want minimal government. I want it elegant. I want it like the structures that allow a human being to walk down the stairs without tumbling and breaking their neck, right? You don't detect that you are tightly regulated internally by these structures that are monitoring your every move and, putting just the right amount of energy and kicking your foot forward just the right distance and all of that. The point is, it's not interfering with your ability to live. It's actually protecting you from very serious things, and it is freeing you to think about whatever you need to think about going down the stairs. So, elegant governance, that's the question. Is it possible, and can it be done in such a way that it cannot be turned against the people, which is where we are? And when I'm talking about good governance, I'm not talking about taking the government we have and reforming it so it behaves itself. I no longer believe that's possible. And believe me, we've been on the wrong end of this thing, and we've looked it directly in the eye. It's frightening.
How do you respond?
Yeah, this is a little orthogonal, but I'm reminded, I've made this analogy before. There's a concept in evolutionary biology called phylogenetic constraint, which refers to that which has been built by evolution in the past, and which you are now downstream of, and you've got a suboptimal form, but you can't get to an optimal form without going through an adaptive valley to get there. So the most famous example of phylogenetic constraint is the vertebrate eye, where our eye, compared to the eyes of cephalopods, of squid and octopus, is actually built backwards. So the photons actually have to go through the cell bodies of the photoreceptors before hitting the actual business end of the photoreceptors, which means there's a lot of noise, a lot of cleanup that has to happen, a lot of brain activity that has to be done among all vertebrates who see in order to have a clear vision. And it's much less efficient than what squid and octopus have. Wouldn't it be great if we could have their eyes? But we can't, because in order to rebuild our eye backwards, we'd have to go through many hundreds, thousands, millions of generations of reducing our vision and, maybe coming out the other side with something built better. So imperfections exist. Evolution doesn't build perfection. And this is a different question from that of trade-offs, but that, of course, is always the case as well. But the analogy that I've made before in the context of higher ed and college presidents is one of bureaucratic constraint, right? Like bureaucratic constraint also exists, where you start to get some well-intentioned policy in place or well-intentioned institute within the college, within the university, and, before long, you have policy upon institute upon policy, you got HR departments, you got DEI departments, you got all of these things that even if all of the intentions were right and there was no conspiracy and there were no evil villains behind the scenes laughing while rubbing their hands together, you have a system that is not just incompetent, but it also is ripe for capture. And so now, to the degree that evil is anywhere in the environment, it can walk in and take the thing. And bureaucratic constraint and phylogenetic constraint are dissimilar in that you can't undo the vertebrate eye and get to a more elegant eye like that of the squid and octopus, because we are inherently individual organisms in addition to being part of bigger groups. Organizations would appear to be partsable, right? That you could say, you know what, I can see that that's the problem. Let's just get rid of that thing. But to mix my metaphors, you start pulling on one of those threads and pretty soon you discover actually the entire thing is going to fall apart, because there are not just things built on each other, but also there is someone defending that little fiefdom everywhere you go. So whereas bureaucratic constraint shouldn't be as tough a problem to solve, like phylogenetic constraint is actually intractable. You actually, like, once you're stuck with the thing and you can't do anything about it. We're not going to end up with the more efficient eyes of octopi. It's just not going to happen. Bureaucratic constraint should be more tractable, but we don't seem to be able to figure out how to, honestly burn to the ground what needs to be burned to the ground and phoenix ourselves back from the ashes with the core principles, say, from the founding documents in place.
It's funny because I think when I hear that, I think about, one of the first books I read in my sort of modern adult journey into the world of ideas was Nassim Taleb's The Black Swan. And he's got a great analogy for, I think, what the marketplace is, because, and that is that the ocean designs the boat, right? That there's all these boats on the bottom of the ocean. They failed. So the ones that were well fitted to the ocean are the ones you see floating on top. And so it's not man that designs the boat, it's the ocean, which I think evolutionarily, maybe that's the fitness environment, but it's, and that in sort of the free marketplace, and I've worked inside big corporations like Viacom, now called Paramount, and you'd see this happen. You'd see it happen, especially when there'd be a recession. So I worked in a division of MTV that produced the cartoons like Beavis and Butthead. And when the dot-com bust came around, that whole division was eliminated. Like they were forced. Every time there's been a recession, it's like there's the old saying, like, you can tell who's got pants on when the water goes out to sea. And that sort of burning down the trees so that there's fresh growth beneath the brush happens if you have a competitive environment. It seems like a lot of what we've got is sort of monopolization. Like, well, Harvard is manifestly corrupt to the point where it will allow a plagiarist to stay on the payroll making $1 million a year just about, despite being obviously unqualified and a disgrace. But I guess they can do that because they've got like a $60 billion endowment, right? I mean, maybe your background in academia is helpful here. Like, how do you understand those institutions and their role in our moment right now? It feels like they're playing a big role in what's going wrong. But it's been easy to overplay it, and I've gone back and forth on how important the role of academia has been in ruining everything.
Well, it has been the tip of the spear in ruining everything. It was starting with the minds of several generations of students who have now gone on to staff all of the institutions that are now abusing their power. So I don't think you could overstate its importance. But in this discussion, I think it is important to understand that really, if you reverse engineer what I'm arguing the goal of civilization should be, the liberation of individuals, and you take the principle that you're describing, the ocean designs the ship, which is, I would point out, it's a brilliant analogy, but it's only partly true. Because, yes, there is selection, but it's not like the designers had ships in their mind, and as ships went down at sea, the designers that had the bad designs in their mind lost out in competition to the good ones. These are also human beings, and they discover that things that they thought were true didn't actually function in practice. A ship comes back and it leaks where it wasn't expected to, that sort of thing. So the point is, humans can do something no other creature can do, which is it can build a ship in its mind, and it can test it in its mind, and then it can put it onto the sea and see how that test works out and refine a design. It can leapfrog that evolutionary process. So what should we be doing with the institutions? What should government be shooting for? It should be shooting to create the competitive environment in which what profits is innovation rather than rent-seeking. And the problem is, you will get a cartoon version of this. Everybody thinks there are rent seekers and there are innovators. Nope. Every fortune is composed of a mixture of these two things, right? Some of them may be all rent seeking, but the innovators will create a fortune and then they will parlay that fortune into a much bigger one through rent seeking, and they will have the sense that they are there because they're self-made when in fact they are not. So what you want is a system that makes rent-seeking unprofitable and otherwise leaves people free to innovate and discover by whatever process.
So you just brought up competition, as John had in your last question to us, and it prompted me to think about one of the dichotomies that we are being forced to choose between, which is not, it's not a natural choice. We need both, and it's competition and cooperation.
Yep.
And we find, we find people who speak in terms of markets talking about competition. And we find people in academia now, and increasingly in the media and in the schools, and anyone who's graduated from academia in the last 20, 30 years, talking in terms of cooperation being the thing that we must prioritize. And of course, it's an easy road to take down to end up at a socialist worldview there. And we were seeing this in the 90s in grad school in biology, in fact, even with some graduate students wondering why there was so much mention of competition in ecology textbooks, when really, obviously, it should be 50-50 and there should be just as much discussion of cooperation. Well, no. Why? Why do you imagine that these two forces exist and therefore they must exist in equal ratios in the world? That is an assumption that is not based in reality, or at least that is an assumption, and you need to demonstrate to all of us that that is true before you then bring back this complaint about the ecology textbooks. That said, both are fundamental. Like, both exist in necessarily and in considerable abundance in all human operations and non-human operations. And it is a mistake of both, academia and, say, free market people who speak as if it's one or the other. The many in academia right now would have us believe that any competition is bad. That's a 4-letter word. And it's not as stark on the other side, but discussion of things that sound like the collective, or we're going to have to collaborate now. Don't make me collaborate if I don't want to. That sounds like socialism. Like, you know what? We need to bring these concepts back together and recognize that neither exists without the other, and that both have been around almost since the very beginning of life on Earth.
Yeah, I mean, I think to geek out with my econ hat, it was like Ronald Coase said that firms are islands of socialism in a notion of competition. That and as an entrepreneur myself, it's like you want people to come together and to that's why you come together as employees, where you're not transacting with every day, because you're just in it together, trying to work through what you're going to build and learn from the mistakes, and then it does feel like competition is the fitness environment around which like things that look kind of like a family are trying to all get along together in it. Um, this reminds me, and I think this is a great moment to sort of shift into the themes of your book.
Before we do that, can
Please.
I reframe this just slightly?
Please.
I think we're just having a linguistic conflict here, but competition is inevitable. It is inherent to the fact that if there is an abundance of a limiting resource, a population is programmed to grow until there isn't an abundance. So competition on the way to reaching that state exists, and competition at that state exists. You can't escape it. What people need to understand is that cooperation is wonderful. It is a mode of competition. That's what it is. That's why it exists. And so the collaboration within a family is because there are other families out there, and ultimately there's not enough resource to go around. The collaboration within a corporation, same thing. Every time you see collaboration, you are looking at people who are uniting because they are more powerful together, and that this is in fact such a fundamental principle that it is the very same reason that you function as an organism of some 30 trillion cells that have all agreed to put their differences aside and function together, right? They're not doing that because they think it's cool. They're doing that because they are more ferocious in competition if they do that than they are if they function separately.
Multicellularity is one of the earliest forms of cooperation.
Yep.
Okay, this reminds me of one of the things that came out of the book that is, and that is part of the work you guys have done, which is the notion of evolution, how we understand what evolution is and how it works. So, I've heard of this term, the selfish gene, but you're laying out something that's more complex than that, than like a selfish gene. That there's a groupishness to evolution inside our bodies and then even inside our tribes. So explain this to me. How do you understand evolution to work that's not this purely competitive individual genetic story that we may have heard?
Well, first of all, a couple things that should be on the table just from the get-go. The model of evolution that we're using is not exactly the classic model of evolution. The classic model of evolution was doing a pretty good job of progressing through 1976, and it actually came pretty much to a standstill at that point with the publication of Dawkins' Selfish Gene. So Selfish Gene was state-of-the-art thinking, and we haven't really moved on from it. Now, there's nothing inherently about the selfish gene perspective that's inconsistent with anything we've said so far, but the problem is that it has not resulted in the proper extrapolation about what must be true, evolutionarily speaking. And we are using an upgraded model that would be controversial among many of our colleagues, but it basically views the evolutionary drive as the drive for particular genetic spellings to lodge themselves as far into the future as they can. And the range of ways to do that is simply greater than the Evolution 101 textbook would suggest. The fact is, there is a fractal process, meaning a process that is independent of scale, in which things that we see taking place in the body are reflected in things we see taking place in a family, in a larger population, across many species. And so understanding that getting into the future is a difficult puzzle and that there are many valid ways of getting there. The idea that simply producing more children is the way to get there is incorrect. It is an oversimplification of the idea of genetic fitness.
On humans, the species of humans puts the lie to that, right? Because what have we done? We have prioritized having far fewer children than many of our brethren and spending much more time growing them. They're born literally helpless and require our nearly constant attention for a number of years and then a lot of input for many years after that. That would not appear to be the best way to succeed if it was only about numbers.
Yeah, so
Likewise, the fact that go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I want to take a step back because I maybe jumped 2 steps into the deeper water than some viewers might be ready for. So could you just like break it down like and this is reasonable, like I'm a child. Like, what is the classical evolution story like in it, briefly? That, and then what was the selfish genes contribution to that? Like, give me background, because I know as we get into the book, this evolutionary lens, as you like to call it, is the filter for so much of the book and so much of what you guys talk about.
So the simple evolutionary story, and mind you, it's not that we disagree with it. It's true to a point, but it doesn't have enough horsepower to explain many of the things that we claim in the classic version that it must explain. So the classic story is that genes are the genetic spellings are what they are because they result in designs that increase a factor that we call fitness. And that fitness is essentially synonymous with how many offspring did you produce. And that's all true. In general, the more offspring you produced, the better you did. It's not a bad, if you wanted to just eyeball how successful one creature was compared to another, you could do this. But it results in paradoxes that become unresolvable. So, for example, if you were going to compare the fitness of 2 individuals, and one of them has 2 offspring and one of them has 100 offspring, right? But they're otherwise similar. Well, we'd say, well, one has outcompeted the other by 50 times, right? What if the one that had 100 offspring has no grand offspring because something about the way they got to that increased number meant they couldn't survive some condition that showed up later? Well, then the answer is then their fitness should be 0. But we don't have a way of counting that because they had 100 offspring. That seems like really great success. So the question is, can the evolutionary process see that difference? And what does it, it doesn't think anything. But if we are to project thought onto it so that we can understand the dynamics, what would it think about an individual that cheated in order to have greater reproductive success today at the expense of reproductive success 5, 10, 20 generations in the future? We can't answer that question. Similarly, we have paradoxes. You will all have heard that the way evolution works is there are random mutations in our genomes. Most of those mutations are bad. Occasionally a mutation is good. When a mutation is good, selection means that selection will find that mutation because it will result in the greater fitness of the organism that has it. And so we are the collection of all of those mutations that happen to be better. True enough. But the problem is it doesn't get anywhere near explaining how selection could take an animal that looks like a shrew and turn it into a bat, right? That is not about a change in a spelling, because for one thing, you could build the bat out of materials that are exactly the same as in the shrew. And in fact, they are composed of materials that are very similar. So changing the spelling of the genes doesn't alter the structure of the animal in a way that transforms it from a terrestrial creature to a flying one. That's something else. And so I guess the way I would say it is the story that we tell about the way evolution works was initially pretty close to true. But we are now so many generations into evolution finding ways to enhance its own capacity to discover what is possible that it is foolish to look at that initial cartoonish presentation and imagine that that's how everything came to be this way, because there are accelerators that have been discovered by selection which we have yet to understand.
If I may pick up on 2 of those points. With regard to how it is that we as scientists understand selection and understand fitness, it is a human near universal that we look for a moment, a snapshot, a static rule, and say, that's the thing. And so it does seem like, I would actually put story in a slightly different category, maybe, but that may just be because of things that I'm otherwise thinking about. But I'm speaking more about our tendency to, for instance, say, in a different but related domain, walk into an ecosystem and say, oh, this is the moment that we must preserve, not recognizing that actually maybe that ecosystem was created in turn by Native Americans 300 years ago, and actually what you're preserving is a really weird transitional moment, and it's going to be very, very hard to preserve that thing for all time, because that was never a static thing. So we arrive at some moment and go, oh, let's do that. And often the moment that we are trying to preserve, or the thing that we have decided to measure, is not either preservable itself because life isn't static, or the thing that we've decided to measure isn't the best measure. It's an okay proxy to start, but it isn't actually universally a good proxy. And so with regard to fitness, how many kids did you have? That's a pretty good first proxy. It's really good as a first proxy, but it doesn't end up being sufficient to actually assess how fit you are. And one of the main reasons is exactly as Bret's talking about. So there we get into lineage selection, which we don't go into in the book particularly. With regard to, how do you turn a shrew-like creature into a bat-like creature? The phrase that you didn't use in your answer, Bret, was explorer modes. So there are all of these things that we are beginning to see in evolutionary systems that look like a reaching out with lots and lots of possibilities and then a pruning. And the reaching out with lots of possibilities and then a pruning isn't accounted for in the standard model of evolution. And so, the example that I like best here, although there are many at different scales, both spatial and temporal, is that of neurogenesis in vertebrate development. So as our brains develop, how is it that the neurons are forming in the brain? And what we now know to be true is that early in development, and I believe this goes through like midway through gestation through like 2 years of life or so-ish, you have such profligate neurogenesis, such amazing production of neurons, that brains at that age have more than brains of adults. That you have way overproduction, and that's what it looks like to us, like, oh, well, if you're just going to get rid of it, that was an accident, that was an error. It's like, no, this model that we are working from here and begin to introduce in the book is actually that so-called overproduction isn't an error. That is exploration, and then with use, in the case of neurons in the developing human or other vertebrate brain, with use, there's pruning. There's apoptosis. There's pruning of those connections and of those neurons back to a state that, probably there's error there. Probably there's some that got pruned that shouldn't have been, and maybe some that remain that aren't as useful as they might be. But it's a much better adapted brain to the environment in which that organism developed than it would have been if it had just produced the right number of neurons to begin with, which is to say the number that you would arrive at. So just to make up numbers here, you start at 0, maybe you produce 1,000 and you go back to 100, and those are completely made up numbers at both the absolute and the relative scale. But if you just produced 100 to begin with, what are the chances that those would be as close to the right 100 as if you went up to 1,000 and then pruned back? So the going up and then pruning back, the exploration, produces a kind of flexibility and probably almost certainly better end outcome than you would if you just went forward slower.
That's so, the thing that I think about is you're going to head out on an expedition to a new territory, and you bring more tools than you'll need once you've run there once. Okay, I don't know what I'm going to need this and this and this. I better bring this. I better bring that. I better bring this too. And you pack your bag, and it's too heavy, but you don't know what you're going to need. And then after you've laid the trail, the next time you go, you drop half the stuff off in your garage. It's like, well, it turned out I didn't need that hammer. I didn't need these claws. I didn't need 2 sets of shoes. It was not as rocky as I thought. I mean, is that like a good analogy for what you're describing?
I think so.
So let's take it to its logical extreme, though. This is something we explore quite thoroughly in the book. Human beings are a bit of a paradox if you use the model advanced in the Selfish Gene or any standard evolution textbook. Because in us, our genomes have offloaded the evolutionary work to a cultural layer. In other words, our genes have produced a mind that is less programmed than other creatures in an extreme form. Now that has tremendous vulnerabilities that come along with it. If you put a human child in an impoverished developmental environment, they will not develop the full set of skills that they will need in adulthood, and it's tragic. Why would selection run the risk of taking the work of creating a functional adult creature away from the genome and putting it in this process that is fraught with the risk of being incomplete or incorrect? And the answer is that it is the flip side of something else that's very special about human beings. Generally, if we say, what is a leopard, right? A leopard is the response to a particular set of opportunities, right? A leopard and its niche are really inseparable. It's not true for humans. Humans exist in many different niches simultaneously, and if we look back over human history, that number grows tenfold. How is it possible to have one species inhabiting a huge diversity of niches? And the answer is, we have a generalist platform. The robot that is the human can do a lot of different things, but no individual can do all of those things. The question is the software program, and that software program is actually self-authoring. It writes itself through an evolutionary process that is not exactly like the one that accounts for our genetic evolution. And this is something, it's a very strange thing. Richard Dawkins is the first person to properly describe how this must take place. But even he did this in chapter 11 of The Selfish Gene in 1976. He provides us the toolkit to understand human beings. But he himself doesn't understand it. He doesn't see how much power is in what he laid out in chapter 11.
That toolkit coming under the name of memes.
Yeah, this is where the concept of memes comes from, where most people are familiar with that on the internet, funny
Is mimetic.
cartoons. Right. But what he was really saying was that there's something that is like a gene, that is cultural, that either flourishes or perishes, and the ones that work really well proliferate and divide, and that there's an evolutionary process in culture. What he doesn't see, even still, is that that is not an analogy for genetic evolution, but it is actually a tool used by the genes to solve a problem that the genes evolved too slowly to solve themselves. And it means that you can take a human being and you can totally revolutionize the way it finds enough resources to survive and protects itself from the elements. You can change it entirely without altering the genes. It can happen entirely at the cultural level. And that means that the word species is kind of a poor fit for us, because in some ways a human population that does something, a human population that profits from the salmon that return from the sea every year, that human population is a species level away from its cousin that is hunting antelope. I guess it wouldn't be antelope, but it would be deer on the mainland. Right? Those two versions of being human are radically different at the level of the niche they inhabit, but in terms of the people, they are unchanged, or virtually so. So that's an amazing capacity that humans have evolutionarily that is not mirrored. There are other much dimmer versions of it in some other creatures, but we are absolutely unique in the degree to which we can revolutionize our niche through time and across space. It's our special gift.
And to the degree that there are other organisms with a very large home range, effectively, who span continents, they are generalists to some degree, but so are the individuals. Whereas humans, by and large, as we discuss in the book, are a generalist species, but most of us are specialists to some degree, which means also that a lone human is a dead human. Right? You cannot exist very effectively, by and large, except under very extraordinary and frankly probably somewhat artificial environment conditions as a single human. It's just impossible to do everything that you need to do for yourself as a human. Whereas a mountain lion or a crow, both of which also have extraordinarily broad ranges and are also very smart and long-lived and such, have different ways of being. Crows are more similar to us than a mountain lion. But a mountain lion, even though there's mountain lions in Canada and in Brazil, an incredibly large range, not just across east-west on the continent, but an incredibly broad latitudinal range. That's extraordinary for an organism that lives entirely outside to be able to deal with the tundra and the Amazon. But each individual mountain lion has to be able to do everything it can do for itself. Whereas those, salmon hunting people of the Salish Sea and the plains hunting people of the middle of the North American continent, individuals do not have to do everything. There will be people among the Salish who are better at rope building than at salmon hunting, and people who are better at finding camas and such. There are specialists in those populations, whereas in mountain lions, you don't get specialists.
And if I can just finish that off a little bit, I'm not intending to give Dawkins a hard time because, he's an intellectual hero of mine for what he accomplished. What I'm troubled by is the fact that we haven't built on it properly. And just to make it clear what I mean, Dawkins he thinks that the cultural evolutionary landscape is a new primeval soup, he calls it. And that means that it's interesting to him that it evolves in a way that is like genes, but he doesn't see how close the relationship that genes are using this layer to solve a problem, to the extent that he thinks that a good example of how this process works is the song Happy Birthday. Now, the song Happy Birthday is a good example, but he doesn't understand that Catholicism or Judaism or Buddhism are much more powerful examples of what this process can do. That
Right.
These are these massive co-adapted meme complexes that solve really important human problems and have allowed human flourishing, right? In fact, he thinks that those things are mind viruses, that in fact, these religions are parasitizing the evolutionary creature, which is frankly a preposterous notion.
You're bringing together something that for me has only now for the first time as an adult started to crystallize in our times, and that is so in the book you call, if I remember this correctly, like this sort of this problem of what is it, nature or nurture, genes or culture. I think you unify them under the omega principle. Is that right?
Correct.
That this is what's happening, that actually our genetics and our culture have always been with us. I'd love to maybe understand like why we are the only ones that are like that, but that there's this bunch of stuff going on right now, and if I'll indulge in trying to tell a story that we can then chop apart, because this is the way I understand the problem we face, which I think is a lot like the way both of you do, which is, all right, we're this super adaptable creature that sort of is an extended being because we rely on each other in groups. We rely on our cultural norms rather than just instinct. So you look at a spider and it spins a web of incredible complexity, and it's like, we don't think it was taught how to do this by a teacher, so it just knows how to do it somehow. But we actually need teachers, so we do all this stuff that's weird to preserve knowledge over time and build a culture and then preserve it and then live and rely on it. And we specialize into all these crazy things, including seemingly purposeless and idiotic specialties in academia and otherwise, where all we are doing is talking to each other in a small group about critical consciousness or whatever other nonsense. But then we face this problem that seems to have really become especially acute now. This is how I'm starting to see the moment we're in, which is our hardware part hasn't adapted as far and as fast as our culture part or our software part. And so now we have this thing happening where there's this divergence, and we're seeing things that you would think shouldn't be happening. Like, why should the wealthiest society ever to grace the face of the earth be increasingly miserable? Like, that's weird. Like, why should our kids be facing higher rates of anxiety, suicide, and depression than anyone of their age in prior times in recent history? And one way I've started to think about this is that, well, it might turn out that a bunch of stuff that we've always seen as costs, like having to wait for stuff, having to struggle, having to have pain, having to not know what to do next and be bored, that these actually turn out to be benefits, not costs. And that we sort of took for granted all this stuff, like being in a childhood where you basically are kicked out of the house and you run around as early as 8 years old, and nobody's paying attention to you, and you could easily kill yourself. And that turned out to be like so essential and necessary to be a functional adult and be happy and healthy. But now we see that as scary and crazy, and everything needs to be bubble wrapped, and we won't let you out on your own until you're like 14 years old. So there's something has happened, and it feels like it's happened in the past couple decades, where our adaptability has taken us so far, but our hardware is now getting creaky, and our cultural software is becoming a kind of autoimmune disease for the hardware, and it's attacking itself. And I'll stop there, but does that resonate? Does that make any sense?
Yeah. I mean, there's a ton there. I feel like we could riff on this for forever. What humans are, having so few children, to go back to that point, makes us prime to absolutely prioritize never losing a child, right? And anyone who has lost a child, and we are lucky never to have lost a child, has a hard time going on. And I don't know how you do go on. That said, someone in the body of a child, in the body of an adult on their 18th birthday, who's been in metaphorical bubble wrap for their entire life, and then what has been told to the parents is, and now they're off, right? Why is anyone surprised that kid, that toddler, in terms of their mental capacity, if they've really been completely protected and, snowplowed and helicoptered and all of the metaphors we use for the bad parenting of the 21st century, if they've never been allowed to take any risks, do anything for themselves, make any of their own choices, why do we assume that now they can? Of course they can't, because the long childhoods of humans is not a mistake. We are not giraffes, right? We're not born and able within 20 minutes to run from predators, right? The fact that we have such long childhoods is telling us something about what we are, and what we are is we need to learn what we are from experience. So, again, back to this question of, what, if it's not the credential, what is it that allows a plumber or the best doctors to be the best doctor or the best plumber? It's not actually largely the credential. If you're doing something that requires a credential and being an adult doesn't require a credential, what is it that allows you to be a successful adult? It's relevant experience in the ways that, in the ways of your culture and whatever your chosen vocation and avocations and passions are. So if all you've ever done is go to school and everyone's done everything for you, not just protected you from all risk and pain and fear, but also prepared all of your meals and made sure that the electricity was always on, and the heat, and you've never been cold, and nothing has ever happened to you, of course you can't do anything. Of course you have no ability to either accomplish anything physical in the world or to regulate your own emotions, because you've never been expected to. So, increasingly there is, it's not even that niche anymore, but there are these more public movements to, get outside every day in the morning and, put your feet in the ground and look at the sun and, embrace the actual physical world where you are. And, hallelujah, it's about time. I guess I do wonder how it is that one or two, depending on how you count and where the breaks are, generations of people, at least in the weird world, especially in the United States, became convinced that it was actually the right move to lock the children up in boxes and protect them from all experience for their entire lives. And how do we get out of it? Like those children, when we were college professors, we were seeing some number of people who had been helicoptered and snowplowed and frankly drugged with illegal drugs that were then fashionable, mostly speed for boys and anti-anxiety and antidepressant meds for girls. Since the ages of like 8 and 10, these kids were coming to us and going like, okay, I'm now in your class. I'd like to get myself off the drugs. It's doable, but it's tough at that point. And if they've waited until they're 25 or 30, I don't know what's doable anymore. So what do you do if individuals can do it, but it's tough and they need to be really motivated and really driven to get themselves off the drugs and to get themselves some experience that they've never been allowed to have before? Individuals can do it, but it's going to be hard. How do you do it when it's an entire population? When almost everyone in an entire generation, everyone between certain ages is similarly hamstrung by their own developmental environment. And therefore, yes, they still have agency, they still have some autonomy, but this was done to them. This was largely done to them by well-meaning people, their parents, their teachers, who actually thought that they were doing the right thing and they weren't. I don't know how we fix a generation-wide problem. We were in the business. We didn't know that that's what we were signing up for when we became college professors, but because of the weirdness of what Evergreen was, where we were professors, we knew our students extremely well, and we took them on field trips, and we took them into the Amazon. Like, we took them far afield, away from cell phones, and broke bread together, and had campfires, and threw the Frisbee around, and yes, also taught them evolutionary biology and statistics and philosophy and such. But it was those one-on-one and one-on-few interactions where we were able to demonstrate to them, you have incredible capacity, but it's going to take some risk, and it's going to take some pain, and it's going to take confronting fear, and you're going to be uncomfortable. And that's part of it.
It's this strange feedback loop of being afraid of pain while knowing and celebrating for ourselves the things that we survived that were painful, that made us who we are. So every adult who has any level of success went through a painful process that they wouldn't change for anything because they know of the learning from that pain. And yet and I'm 46, so my son's about to be 19. We don't want our kids to have that for understandable reasons, unless you stop and take 2 deep breaths and realize, well, why would I want to deny my child the very learning process that made me who I am? And it feels like every other layer of attack on Western civilization right now may be stacked on top of this fundamental error, that the woke weirdo stuff and the path of the post 10/7 realization for me of, holy cow, like, our universities are shot through with people who are just actually like Jew-hating crazy people. Like, this is insane. We met for the first time at ARC, and that was the backdrop of that experience for me. I was gobsmacked by the Western response to 10/7. And it's like, yes, 10/7 was awful, but that I kind of understood. Like, well, yeah, that's happening all the time. There's always horrible stuff being done to people. But the wealthiest young people in all of human history taking to the streets to side with the rapists and the murderers and the Jew haters, I'm still rocked. I'm like a different person as a result of that. And so we can tunnel into that if you want, but Bret, how does this connect into the things that are at the foreground of your mind?
Yeah, I want to challenge one thing you said a bit ago about the hardware not being up to snuff and the cultural layer being like an autoimmune disease. There is some truth in the second part of that, but I want to unpack why, and it does go directly to your point about the failure of the developmental environment that we've given to people being explanatory for all of the dysfunctions, which are really symptoms of it. I think there's a lot of truth in that. But the book is called A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. The alternative title, which I sometimes wonder if it wouldn't have been the right one, is Hyper-novelty. The book is really about this process of hyper-novelty. And
What is
the
that?
idea is we, because of what we've discussed with the cultural evolutionary layer being capable of adapting much more rapidly than the genetic layer, we are the fastest evolving animal species that has ever existed, by far. That capacity to evolve, however, to adapt, is outstripped by the rate of technological change, to the point, and this is a crucial threshold that we have crossed, we do not even get to be adults in the same environment in which we were children. By the time we become adults, everything's changed enough that whatever you figured out when you were a kid doesn't apply anymore. That is a rate of change that is so fast that there's no way for evolution to deal with it, right? We simply don't have the mechanism that would allow us to change with that level of rapidity. Now, it is always going to be true in the cultural layer that ultimately culture evolves beautifully, and it creates adaptations that are the rival of wings and eyes. And in fact, we have cameras and airplanes. We can create things culturally that are every bit the equal of those things. But the process that allows that to happen is a process of pruning. There is there is conscious discovery of new possibilities, but then the ones that made sense persist. The ones that didn't make sense end up on the bottom of the sea, as you point out. And so things get better over time culturally. But the degree to which whatever is present in a culture that is rapidly changing, you don't know which of the things that are popular at the moment are actually good for you, is devastating. In other words, the signal to noise ratio is very low in culture. We have no idea what we are encountering. Things that look very successful, that are catching wildfire, may be absolutely terrible for us, right? The fads, the drugs that Heather's pointing to that we gave so many kids, harbors tremendous dangers that if there is a human species here 500 years from now, we will look back and we will know which of these things we should never have touched. But in the present, you can't know. So what is really going on is that we have this very powerful toolkit over in culture space, but we don't have any ability to sort the wheat from the chaff in the immediate, and that is resulting in us essentially poisoning ourselves so that we are literally sick psychologically, physically, socially, and that is the tragedy of the moment.
All right, this is the end of the video, but it is not the end of my conversation with Bret and Heather. We've got a second part coming up soon, so if you don't want to miss that, subscribe to the channel and ring that bell so you'll get notified when the new one goes live. And it is a spicy part of the conversation. We talk about what's happened with gender ideology and the medication that our kids are on, and how both of them have seen that transformation firsthand as college professors. We even get the tables turned on me, and Heather asks me some pretty interesting questions about my own beliefs. So I don't want you to miss it. Be sure to subscribe, and thanks for watching Dad Saves America.